Well, it's great to see all of you out there. I just realized that since I'm traveling by myself on this trip, whenever I go to the dinner, usually at the restaurant, I just say, put me at the big table, and I just crash the big table no matter who's there. So I've gotten to know a lot of you from that way, and I'll probably try to get to know the rest of you between now and Reykjavik. So don't be surprised if I just plunk myself down beside you. And I was just looking at, thank you. I didn't pay you $5 for that, did I? I was just looking at this projection, and this must be somebody with an Arctic Institute in this projection or whatever, because it looks as though that Svalbard is as large as Iceland and almost as large as Britain here. So somebody from up north did this. I remember taking my cartography classes many years ago, but I can't remember which projection that is. Today, especially early this morning, I found myself thinking of a book I read many years ago, Homer's The Odyssey, where Odysseus was lashed to the mast by his crew so they wouldn't be swayed by the sirens. And I don't think I was tied to the mast in here, but so we wouldn't steer the boat into the rocks of the island, but there might be a lot of sirens on board, I don't know. I'd like to do a shout out as well. It shows my age, doesn't it? A shout out to all of those who were actually watching this on Viking TV, but are a little bit under the weather and can't make it right now, so I appreciate you tuning in, either live or on Memorex. And I'd like to thank the captain and his crew for trying to even out the bumps wherever they can. And one more thanks to a gentleman by the name of Motoro Shintaro. You might not know who Motoro Shintaro is, but I looked him up today because he's a Japanese engineer who actually worked for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. And in 1922, he was the major person who invented the fins for the stabilizers, which are used in boats. So a shout out to Shintaro. This talk, just want to preface a little bit in terms of my role in it. I'm going to try to be as neutral or objective as possible, and everybody says that and you can never be purely objective because your own values and biases come into this. But I am going to try to be as objective as possible about the topic. And I've used, in terms of the sources for this, I've used peer-reviewed sources, so that means that they've been acknowledged and accredited by others, scholars, that they're unbiased as much as possible. Our government publications, data, or this, I think in one place I'm going to refer to surveys that were done by a nonpartisan survey group of Greenlanders. Now I've really got your attention, haven't I? Also, although we're not visiting the Faroes, it'd be great to visit the Faroes as well, but I thought this is an interesting topic. We're steaming away from Greenland, but given the role that almost that duality of the Faroes and Greenland play as territories or somewhat territories of Denmark, I thought it'd be interesting to see, well, how have they evolved in terms of the relationship with Denmark? And has their history and relationship changed over the time? Are there any echoes of that relationship between one and the other? Okay. So without further ado, let's go to this. And this, I'm going to start this presentation with Greenlandic, and I'm going to end the presentation with Greenlandic. And so I was wandering through the streets yesterday of I've already forgotten the name of it, Palmyra. And I came across I struck up a conversation with an older Inuit woman. And I said to her that I was from Canada. And she said, oh, no, you're not from Canada. You're from, and then she said something that was unintelligible to me at least. And so I went back, and of course that fount of knowledge, Google, I looked up what the word for Canada is in Greenlandic. And there is no word for Canada, but there is a word for Inuit living in Canada that are Inuit Nunangat. And now I remember that was what she called me, Inuit Nunangat. So I don't know whether that makes me an honorary Inuit, but from Canada over in Ellesmere Island or not. But that's where she said she said I was. And then, of course, because I'm a little bit of an anal person, I said, well, wait a second now. We've got lots of passengers here from places other than Canada. So what do the Greenlanders call them, or in Greenlandic? So the Greenlandic word for America is Amerikap. And, well, what about England or Australia? There's no Greenlandic word for Australia. Sorry, my Aussie friends out there. But it's probably because there's no historical context. There weren't very many Greenlanders and Aussies that got in touch with each other. And there's no Greenlandic word for England, but there is for Britain or Great Britain. In fact, it's Storbritannian, and where store means great. Okay, so the topics today, I just wanted to just outline here. We're going to be looking at the settlement of both of those places and the paths that they've taken, each taken both the similarities and differences towards independence or quasi-independence. And you'll see that I'm going to be moving back and forth between Greenland and the Faroes because I'm going to be talking about it in terms of themes. So I'll talk about the two places back and forth in themes. So hopefully not too confused. I'll mention the name of it if I forget. And then we're going to open it up to a little bit of a broader context than just talking about those places. That's what pointy-headed academics sort of do every once in a while. I wanted to look at it in terms of how island territories in general manage their relationship with their so-called home countries or parent countries. And also introduce you to the concept of islandness. It's something it's not a word that's used very often, but in this interdisciplinary field of island studies that I'm affiliated with, there is a term called islandness, and I'll sort of introduce that to you and see how it might relate to the Faroes Islands or the Faroes and Greenland. The image at the left I put up there, once again, in terms of, depends on the projection, but I found a great slide here, the image that showed if Greenland was plunked right into the United States, what portion of the United States it would take up. So this overview of Greenland, and some of this overlaps with what Penny talked about, and we're both geographers, so it's natural that we're going to overlap. And hopefully it just reinforces some of what she said. The name Greenland or Groenland is the Danish, where the Viking name, if you look at the translation, is Green Earth. The Inuit, and as I say, Penny mentioned this briefly, the Inuit actually prefer Kalilet Nunat, or land of Greenlanders, or Inuit Nunat, or land of the people, to the Danish Greenland or Groenland. Greenland is the largest island in the world by area here. I had to specify area at just over 820,000 square miles, or 2.1 million square kilometers. And I'll mention this just briefly, I'll get back to it. You might want to think about it not by area, but by carrying capacity. Carrying capacity, in other words, the ability to actually support the population. It might not be so large when you measure it in terms of their ability to support their own population. And as I think we've already seen, there's about at least 80% of it that's covered by an ice mass. And the population is about 57,000 people all along the coast, especially the southwest coast. Much of Greenland's population historically and currently is along, as we've seen the fjords, especially in the southwest of Greenland. The exception, of course, is one of the exceptions is the American Thule base up around about halfway up on the west coast. The other aspect of the image here, that Greenland flag, and I know Penny had that. The red and white circle on the white and red background. The white is supposed to represent glaciers and icebergs, and the red is supposed to represent the ocean and the setting sun. A little bit of a Japanese almost allusion to that, isn't it? So an overview of the Faroes now, just so we've both got them as the context. It's located between Iceland, Norway, and Scotland. It's really 17 islands, an archipelago. About 40% of the population is actually on the capital of Tórshavn, or just Haven. And it's named after Thor, the Norse god of thunder. In other words, therefore, if you think of Thor's harbor, Thorhaven. Okay. Area, in terms of area, it's less than 1%, 1/10 of 1% of the size of Greenland, but it's got virtually the same population. And that, once again, reinforces this thing called carrying capacity. In other words, the ability of a place to support its population, whether it's something simple like agriculture and fishing and so on, or whether it's manufacturing services. If those of you are from Manhattan or know of Manhattan, it has, just in Manhattan itself, about 2.3, 2.4 million people in a small place. It's got the carrying capacity, obviously not agriculture, but in terms of what takes place there, to actually be able to have the capacity of holding many more people. I'm actually, as a Canadian, I'm asked this question. People look at Canada in relationship to the United States, and it's only about, I think it's usually a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of population, 40 million people in Canada to about 400 and change in the United States. Say, well, look at all of Canada. You've got room for lots of people there, lots more than you have. And of course, that doesn't account for the fact that 50% of the land mass is that Canadian shield that I talked about in our Newfoundland talk, and it doesn't count for all of the land that's in the Arctic islands of Canada. So when you hear people talk about area, just put your blinders on or filters on for a second and think, well, what does that mean in terms of their ability to actually support population, not just something as simple as area. The Faroes is a derivation of the word Faroe, which is Danish for sheep islands. Maybe our Kiwi friends will have something to say about that. And there was a Faroese lawyer who describes the Faroes as the land of maybes. And what he meant by that is that everyday life is influenced by so many outside factors, like weather and other things. And that makes many small islands very vulnerable because they are at the mercy of outside influences, whether that's climate or whether it's invading armies or whether it's the stock market or demand for products that makes their main industry go up and down in those booms and busts. The Faroese flag, or the Faroes flag, is the cross for Christianity, and then the white represents sea and sky, and the blue and red represent the links to the other Scandinavian countries that have the same coloring. So let's go back, and I'm not going to talk much about the indigenous peoples here because that, I think you've already been exposed to that on Greenland. But some of you have heard of the concept of North America as Turtle Island. And I know First Nations societies and tribes in Canada often talk about North America as Turtle Island. This image that you see on the right here, if you superimposed a turtle over North America, you'd see the body is North America. In fact, Alaska would be the left paw, and sort of Greenland is sort of probably, and the Arctic islands are in the head part of that sort of island. And various indigenous groups, as you can see on the image to the left here, have swept across the northern part of Canada, what is now Canada, and then descended into Greenland from various ways. The Dorset peoples came across, but disappeared about before the Norse arrived in about 1000 AD. And the Thule people are the ancestors of the Inuit, arrived about the same time as the Vikings, in that sort of 1000 AD and beyond. As I think Penny mentioned, there was a mini ice age that took place around the world around that period between about 1400 and 1600 AD, or maybe just a little bit earlier, where the Vikings or the Norse that were on Greenland most likely were forced to retreat down as far south as they could get, to the southwest corner of that. And over time, the rest of Europe, Norway, Denmark, etc., lost contact. The Norse settlement lost contact with Bergen, or vice versa. And Bergen at the time was the center of Danish rule of the time. And this happened coincidentally at the start of the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, when at least 25% of the population of Europe was killed. So it's understandable that with an ice age, a mini ice age taking place, and also pestilence happening, and that's often what was called to a pestilence in Europe, that they would lose touch with the Norse colony. So in fact, Denmark didn't even realize that there was perhaps an extinction of the Norse on Greenland for at least decades and perhaps even centuries. Not until contact was reestablished in 1721 with that Lutheran ministry that arrived. So therefore, you've got this evangelical origin again of established origin. But as is the case with a lot of colonial powers when they come across a new land, it's not purely evangelical. There's often a very close tie between evangelism and proselytizing the natives and trading bases, trading. And the same is the case with Lutheran forays into Greenland. They also, the government at the time, the Danish government, did not want to lose out to both the whalers that were there from the Netherlands, the Dutch whalers, as well as the British explorers. So they realized what was going on as well. So there's always a close connection between evangelism and trading. So the Faroes, unlike Greenland, there was no indigenous population that we know of that was there prior to European contact or European settlement. So the first settlers, most people believe, and I'm taking a page out of Penny's book using a few stamps here. The first settlers were probably Irish monks that arrived there at about 630-35 AD. So in other words, 200 to 300 years before the Vikings came. And that we get that from both the written record, the sagas that existed at the time, that exist at the time, and from the archaeological record evidence from longhouses. But just like the sagas in Greenland and elsewhere, those sagas are written 200 to 200 years after the activities themselves. And then, of course, the Norse, the Vikings, they came here prior to going on to Iceland and on to Greenland. And they arrived between the 9th and 10th century AD from Norway, but they also came from Norse Britain. And I think it's in this presentation, the next one. There was a lot of incentive sometimes when there was a regime change on the mainland of the Nordic countries, and a new king came in, that person would reevaluate some of the reward system, the rewards and the territories that had been given to others. And so sometimes the people that were the Norse that were in Britain had to skedaddle and go somewhere else if they wanted to actually retain their lives. Faroes, once again, the Vikings that were there was never more than 3,000 or 4,000 Vikings at any one time there. And they were mostly independent of Norse rule. Once again, if you want your freedom, your independence, you move a little bit further west, out of the reach of the central government. This image on the left here shows a stamp that, and you can see there shows mixed farming, livestock raising or husbandry, and fishing. In addition to that, the Faroes, the Norse and the Faroes, established one of the oldest parliaments. We hear, in fact, in Iceland, you might have a chance to go to one of the oldest parliaments in the world there. But there was also one in the Faroes. And they called it the ting, or the gathering, or alting, gathered at the community. If it's an alting, it's gathering at the community of Tinganes, or Tinganes in about 900 AD. Since about the 1400 period AD, it was called lagting, or more specific, the law thing. And actually, when we think of our word thing in English now, we think of thing meaning to an object, and it derives from that Old Norse extension of the Old Norse of ting or alting. This was never considered a colony in the Faroes, and it's not a colony because there weren't any indigenous people. So what the word colony is often synonymous with you're actually colonizing some existing population there. As with Iceland and Greenland, the Faroes were a part of the Norwegian kingdom until all were absorbed by Denmark after 1380. In 1380, in other words, after the death of the King of Norway. So let's turn back to Greenland now and its settlement once again. And as I said, it started once again after the Vikings as a Danish Lutheran colony. This image on the left shows Hans Egede, the Lutheran missionary that led the expedition there. And he's represented on a statue that's overlooking the harbor at Nuuk. And for those of you who might be confused, Nuuk was formerly Gotthab, so they just changed their name in 1979. And Nuuk is the Greenlandic word for cape. So one of the things that the Lutheran missionary, of course, was trying to do was convert the Inuit. The colonial policy of Denmark at the time was to try to shield the Inuit from what they called impure civilization. And it's interesting, there's an interesting parallel there. If you look at the Pacific Islands around the same time, some of the colonizing countries were trying to do the same thing. We're trying to shield them from impure civilization, whatever impure civilization. And that's especially the case in the Pacific during the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And some people believe that it's because the seamen and the governments saw what was happening with the Industrial Revolution and how the living conditions in London and elsewhere and Northern Europe were such that they didn't want to see those same kind of mistakes reproduced. So what they tried to, the government, the Danish government was trying to do here was to preserve the sealing culture in Greenland at the time. But, however, when sealing collapsed in the early 1900s, the Inuit were encouraged to adopt export-oriented fishing economy. So they had to move from a subsistence-level economy to a more market-oriented economy, or an export-oriented fishing economy. And also changed from a hunter-and-gathering type of role to more permanent settlement. So ironically, they were actually lost their purity anyway because they were moving into a more quote-unquote modern kind of economy and lifestyle. And since the 1830s, so it's been a while now, both Greenland and the Faroes, along with Iceland, have been moving towards independence. So the image I want to show you there on the right as well is that same statue in 2020. It was doused in red paint, and the word decolonize was painted on the side in Greenlandic. The statue actually remains there. But I should tell you that Greenland did not celebrate the 300th anniversary of the colonization of Egede, the arrival of the missionary in 2021. Greenland, just some of these dates, it became a Danish county in 1953, and achieved home rule in 79. And self-rule in 2008, and this is an image of Queen Margaret arriving at Nuuk or Gudab, celebrating the home rule in the same year that they actually, at the same time, they changed the name, and she was there to sign that transference of powers. So it was at that point that they had the right to self-determination, and they were determined really to achieve independence. And this is an important element, when Greenland was no longer dependent upon the Danish financial support and human labor, in other words, skilled human labor. And those are big ifs in order to get it. because right now Greenland still gets an annual block grant from Denmark of 500 million euros, which is equivalent to about 500 million US dollars. And that's their annual block grant, and that works out to about 8,700, less than 9,000 dollars US for every person that lives on Greenland. The grant constitutes between 20 and 25% of the total economy of Greenland, and 50% of the government revenues. You can see how important that block grant is. And so you can try to increase or intensify your fishing exports, but you're never going to replace the grant, even if you start to increase gold and rare minerals and tourism. So it's going to be a hard slog to try to actually do that. It's changing, but in terms of that human resource thing, some of the elite jobs are still held by Danes, and I think, as Penny or John mentioned, I think it was Penny, those Danes might have lived there for 10 or 20 years, so they're Greenlandic in everything but name only. There is a narrative in Denmark, however, that the Danes are benevolent and the Greenlanders are sometimes viewed as ungrateful. And Greenlanders should feel indebted to Denmark for what they've done for them. So you can perhaps see why there might be a tension there between the Inuit Greenlanders and people in Denmark. World War II, as is the case in a lot of these North Atlantic islands, was a turning point for Greenland. They were cut off from Denmark, which was under Nazi occupation. And so the United States and Britain stepped in. And then after the war ended, you find that there was an increased sense of nationalism emerging in Greenland. Oops, sorry. So Greenland self-rule in 2008. This means they have the right to take control over 28 of the activities or services that we often think of. But so far, they've only actually effectively taken over one of those, and that's his use of resources. Self-rule also froze the block grant, except for inflation. It could increase by inflation, but froze it at that €500 million level. And that meant that any new functions taken on by Greenland could not increase the block grant. And the hope was, therefore, that the profits that are emerging for the government, revenues to the government from natural resources, would pay for either additional activities or functions, and that it would also reduce the block grant. And they were hoping to reduce the block grant by at least 50%. So independence is tied directly, really, to resource extraction. You can see it's almost placing them in a bind there because of that. Although you've got greater level of your ability to determine your own future, you're almost locked into a box in terms of the likelihood of doing it by reducing your economic dependence on Denmark. You also find in the 21st century, in the last 25 years or so, that there's been a shift in the political relationship between a bilateral one, when it was really just Greenland and Denmark relationship, to a much more multilateral one. So now it's not just Greenland and the relationships with Denmark, but it's also what are the relationships with the United States, with Russia, and with China, with the presumed polar Silk Road that might emerge. Greenland is not a member of the EU, and it's neither is Iceland, because it's the reason is that the EU requires certain concessions on every member country in terms of fishing rights. And fishing has been so important for both the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland that they didn't want to give up their independence fishing. So they didn't. That condition is why they didn't join the EU. However, Greenland is a member of the OCT, or the overseas country, and it's an overseas country and territory of the EU, and because of that, they're still eligible for some funding programs. So going back to the Faroes here, and their path to independence, as with Greenland and Denmark, the Faroes are an autonomous, self-governing region of the community of the realm of the Kingdom of Denmark. And as with Greenland, World War II proved to be a pivotal point in their growing sense of nationalism and therefore independence. The UK took control after Nazi occupation of Denmark, and this is an image on the left here of a British soldier in the capital of Tórshavn. They brought with them in terms of, especially afterwards, a growing sense of nationalism I mentioned. So after Iceland's independence in 1944, the Faroes held an independence referendum in 1946. And this image, you can't see it very easily here, but independence was supported by a narrow majority of 50.7% of the people. However, that decision was dissolved by the King of Denmark. He didn't recognize the decision. And the next Faroese government came in and said, well, we don't believe it in any way. We don't want independence anyway. But what they did do was then arrange or negotiate home rule in 1948. So home rule in the Faroes took place 30 years before it took place in Greenland. And so in the Faroes, you also had this takeover rule or act that came in 2005. And the Takeover Act transferred responsibility for everything except for foreign policy, security, and monetary policy, and judicial policy to Greenland, or to the Faroes. The block grant from Denmark to the Faroes, remember it was 500 million to Greenland. To the Faroes, it's only 87 million. And so that's less than 3% of their GDP, compared to that 20 to 25% of Greenland. So economic dependence is not the issue in terms of gaining independence for the Faroes. Really, it's political will, but also the responsibility for security within its large maritime area. And you look at this image on the right-hand side here at the marine area around the Faroes. And if they took over security, the enormous responsibility that is, not only within their 200-mile territorial exclusive economic zone, that circle, but the area around that. It's a huge area to actually take responsibility for. So back to Greenland and superpowers. There's been a lot of recent rhetoric about Greenland, but it's not the first time that rhetoric has risen. And you may remember Damien did his port talk, and he had a slide on one of his port talks on Greenland about the 1946 following World War II, where Harry Truman, I don't think the slide said Harry Truman, offered $100 million to purchase Greenland. But that offer was actually kept secret by the Greenland government, the Denmark government at the time. The Danish government declined that offer, but they did give much more access to the Americans in terms of military bases, so the construction of the Thule base and other things as well in terms of infrastructure development. And of course that air base is now a space base. Most people believe that the American interest in Greenland is less about purchasing territory, and it's more about the following two things. The first is to send a signal to Russia and to China and that possible Polar Silk Road about American foreign policy in the Arctic. You're sending that signal. In this image, you can see the image on the right. If the Northeast Passage opened up, it would take only 18 days for maritime traffic, merchant traffic, to get to Europe, compared to the 30 days it takes now to go the other way through the Red Sea or the Suez Canal. So that's one, is to send a signal to other superpowers about American policy. The second is perhaps to seek concessions on the American presence, whether that's mining or military or something else. But remember that given that Greenland has the right of self-determination right now, Denmark doesn't even have the right to sell Greenland without the consent of Greenlanders. It's Greenlanders themselves that have to make that decision. And I mentioned about a survey. There was a survey undertaken of Greenlanders in January of this year, 2025. And it was only 500 adults they surveyed, so I don't know what the confidence levels are in terms of the accuracy of this, but 500 adult Greenlanders. And it's on the topic of affiliation versus independence. And so these are Greenlanders' opinions. And they found that 8% of those people surveyed wanted American citizenship, and 55% would prefer Danish citizenship. If you look at that other circle, however, 45% wanted independence. However, that independence came with a bit of a caveat there. Independence, but only if it doesn't affect their living standards. When you look at independence unconditionally, so in other words, maybe getting rid of the block grant completely, only 18% support independence. So there's a strong link there between sort of, yeah, we want independence, but maybe not if it's going to affect our living standards. No, so let's step back a little bit and talk about islands, small islands. By the way, many small sovereign islands, they don't like to call themselves a small island states. They prefer to call themselves large ocean states. And it turns it on its head, because the small island state implies it's a derogatory almost term. It's a weakness. But a large ocean state, especially when you have some control over the exclusive economic zone, might really change the nature of how you're viewed by others. Many islands, territories of the world, have a very politically ambiguous relationship with their so-called home nations. So, for example, we can think of Guam and Puerto Rico for the United States, or the Falklands, Cayman Islands, or the British Virgin Islands for the UK, the Azores for Portugal, and the Canaries for Spain. The traditional school of thought is that island territories are fiscal burdens on their patron countries. In fact, there's something that's written that says Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, before he became president, he was the foreign minister. And he was visiting the Pacific territories, and he described the Pacific territories like confetti falling on his shoulders. Just brush that confetti off of his shoulders. That's what they sort of thought at that time. At least one person thought of the French territories. Now that's changed. So what is it that's changed about that? We now see in the 21st century the perception has changed. The islands of the world, especially the territories, have much more political and economic clout. One is that, and I talked about this before in another presentation, that 1977 UN Convention of the Law of the Sea that virtually every power has signed, or every country has signed. And that brought into being that 200-mile exclusive economic zone, which meant that you had exclusive rights to whatever was on the seabed and under the seabed, as well as what was swimming in the ocean at that point. And also the continental shelves, by the way. And the second thing that happened, the other reason why islands started to gain greater cachet, I guess, is geopolitical strategy. And so countries found that maybe it's a little bit better to hang on to these territories because it gives us political, strategic, economic power within a different part of the world, maybe in different oceans, different realms. So, for example, think about China building on reefs, military bases on reefs. If you populate those, and you have a human presence, a population presence there, maybe you might be create a justification for actually expanding your presence there internationally. So they're now, those patron islands, home islands, are now much more likely to support island territories. This image you see here actually is an image of the exclusive economic zones for all of the Pacific Islands. And if you looked at all of the area of those, including, and this is why they might like to call themselves large ocean states, it's greater than the size of Africa. Makes you think about islands in a different way. So what does Denmark get out of this continued relationship, though? Why is it that Denmark is continuing to support these, specifically Denmark? One is that it gives Denmark a seat at the Arctic table. If they didn't have Greenland in some relationship, like where Denmark's located, they're not an Arctic state. They wouldn't have a claim on any kind of the Arctic resources that are there. So especially with ice sheets retreating, with potentially, therefore potentially shipping access going up, you can see why Denmark might be interested. And in fact, in 2014, Denmark, with the cooperation of Greenland, made a claim for almost 900,000 square kilometers of the Arctic. And you can see that sort of that brown area here that goes right across through the North Pole into the Russian exclusive economic zone. And that's one of the difficult things, is when you've got overlapping exclusive economic zones and continental shelves. You're supposed to settle that at an international level. They also might have a greater voice in NATO. So by making sure you've got that relationship, friendly relationship with Greenland, you might have a greater voice in NATO. But given its a high degree of autonomy already, Greenland is in a very advantageous position. Still sort of generalizing here a bit, go back a bit. Well, there have been many referenda that have been held on island territories over the last 20 years. And in most of those referenda, the island peoples are not very anxious, actually, to gain independence or to become completely independent. Just a couple of examples here. The Falklands, or Malvinas, if we've got any Argentinians in the audience here. In 2013, they held a referendum on whether they wanted to remain a British territory or become independent, or join Argentina, in fact. 99.8% people voted for to remain a British territory. I should say that means only 3 people voted to become part of Argentina. In New Caledonia, an archipelago in the Pacific, that's a territory of France. They had a referendum in 2021, and 96% of people voted no to independence. I should say there have been a series of referenda in New Caledonia over the years, required as part of the agreement that France has with New Caledonia. This one, the independence parties actually withdrew from the referendum, so that may explain that large vote. But in every referendum so far, some of them have been a lot closer than that, New Caledonia has opted to stay a territory. And there's on this image here, I've got a referendum that's taken place in Puerto Rico in 2024. This was a non-binding referendum, of course, but in that non-binding referendum, only just under 12% voted for independence. Most people, by the way, voted for statehood. So why not independence? Why do many of these island territories not want to become independent? All kinds of reasons. The first one relates to this image I've got here of the path of some of the storms that took place, Hurricane Irma and Maria. I can't remember whether that was 2014, 2016, maybe 18, can't remember. So one of the reasons is support during times of crises. And research has shown that during those really bad hurricanes, where some of everything was swept off the island, the support from the patron countries was much faster than for the sovereign islands that was trying to get support from United Nations and other aid bodies. So they actually benefited from, in that case, because of their exposure to, because of the relationship they had with their home countries. Health and education support, think of what happened during the COVID pandemic. They often had better health and a quicker response than sovereign independent islands. Lower security and policing costs because they're relying upon the home island to provide that. And access to larger markets for the companies because they don't have to pay tariffs to sell back into the home countries. And you also have a place for your young people potentially to go for work, a labor market. And lower education costs. I remember when I was in Aruba once and was talking to some of the Arubans there, And then many of them send their children to the Netherlands because, the middle and upper class at least, because education, university or college education is virtually free there because of their continued relationship. Independence is more likely where you've got a greater sense of shared identity, that nationalism, and you've got the means to support your continued living standards. So the New Caledonia, for example, with their mining in New Caledonia, or the Faroes. There's general agreement in island studies, the field, that islands may still be vulnerable, but they also are very nimble and flexible and politically entrepreneurial. And that may get them in trouble, as we saw in the case of Newfoundland, but it also can allow them to adapt to changing conditions very quickly. The other thing is I wanted to look at this concept of islandness and identity. And this term islandness, cultural and behavioral term really, it refers really to the level of isolation or peripherality. And many of these small islands, because of that, it encourages very close-knit relationships. In other words, they rely upon each other in times of crisis, especially from the outside. And this is combined with a sense of place or a close connection to an island environment. So it's not uncommon, even within that environment themselves, the social environment, to say, well, where are you from? Who's your father? Because you're trying to place each other in terms of that network of kin relationships. In Canada's Maritimes, I think we already talked about this, outsiders are sometimes referred to as come from a ways. In the British Virgin Islands, by the way, they're referred to as non-belongers. And it's actually written into their constitution, the terms belonger and non-belonger. So you've got what, I hate to get into the weeds, but strong bonding capital, but very weak bridging capital. Very difficult to actually accept or tolerate others. So Faroes in England, we're almost at the end of this now. In the Faroes, we've got a very strong shared identity. It's occurred early on, where they're preserving the language and culture, and you know the island well, and whaling has become a cultural symbol. And this image on the right is their annual whale hunt, pilot whale hunt. In Greenland, there tends to be a tension that exists between a traditional Inuit way of life and vision and a more modern / Danish influenced way of life. And in Greenland, Greenlandness is a major topic of debate. There is a growing solidarity in Greenland with the concept of country, and it's probably been strengthened with the current political debate. So let me end with a good news story. And I think Penny only touched on this, and she allowed me to fill in the blanks. Hans Island is a small island that's uninhabited island between Canada's Ellesmere Island and Greenland. It's only about half a square mile in size, about 1.3 square kilometers. And there's been a territorial dispute there between Canada and Greenland / Denmark from about 1973. And that's based on competing visions or versions of the former indigenous use of the island. And that was finally settled in 2002, where Denmark / Greenland took 60% of the island and Canada took 40% along a natural ridge line. But in 1984, so during the middle of this dispute, the Canadian military planted a Canadian flag and left a bottle of Canadian whiskey there. And the same year, the Danish Minister of Greenland Affairs exchanged it with a Danish flag and left a bottle of schnapps, or sort of a Nordic liqueur, the version of schnapps sort of thing. And the message, welcome to the Danish island. And this went back and forth until it was settled in 2002. I'm not sure if there's any schnapps or Canadian whiskey on board, but if so, I'd be happy to exchange a drink with any Danes that might be on board, and therefore continue the tradition. And I'm going to end this. I said I was going to start and end with Greenlandic. And language is an important element of developing nationalism and culture. This is the longest Greenlandic word in the Greenlandic vocabulary. Don't ask me to pronounce this word, but you can see the English translation on the right-hand side, and you don't need to read it all the way through. But you can so you understand why it might be very difficult to learn Greenlandic. My next talk, thank you very much, is 2 days from now. And I'm just leaving you with this image. It's on the evolution of tourism in Iceland. It's a fascinating story of what tourism has done for Iceland. And that's going to take place on June 26th at 6:30. This place right here. And this image, of course, some of you may have seen this or will see it, is one of the most iconic falls in Iceland, Gullfoss, on the Golden Circle route in Iceland. So thank you very much.